Margaret Whitmore knew something was wrong the moment her key didn't turn. She stood there on her own front porch, grocery bag hanging from her wrist, staring at a lock that no longer recognized her after 32 years of calling that house her home. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway, the same driveway where her son used to ride his bicycle in circles until dark, and for a brief second she wondered if her hands were simply too tired, too old, if maybe she'd forgotten how to hold the key properly. But then she tried again, slower this time, deliberate, steady, and the metal refused her once more, the quiet click of resistance echoing louder than it should have. And that was when the door opened from the inside, not with warmth, not with surprise, but with a controlled, almost rehearsed calm. Ashley stood there, framed by the hallway Margaret had decorated every Christmas for decades, her expression composed, her posture straight, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. "You can stop trying," she said, her voice even, almost polite but hollow. "That key doesn't work anymore." Margaret didn't answer right away. She simply looked at her, really looked at her, the woman she had welcomed into this family, the woman she had once trusted to share Sunday dinners and quiet conversations over coffee. And behind Ashley, just a few steps back, stood Daniel, her son, the boy who used to reach for her hand crossing the street, now standing still, silent, avoiding her eyes as if the ground beneath him held more truth than the woman who raised him. The air felt different, heavier somehow, as if the house itself had shifted its loyalty overnight. Margaret adjusted the grocery bag in her hand, the paper crinkling softly, absurdly loud in the silence between them. "Ashley," she said finally, her voice calm, measured, almost too calm for what was happening. "What is this?" Ashley didn't hesitate, didn't soften. "We've made some changes," she replied, stepping slightly forward, just enough to block the doorway more completely. "It's better this way." Margaret let those words settle, not reacting, not questioning further, because something in the way they were delivered told her that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake that could be fixed with a conversation. This was a decision, a planned one. And Daniel still said nothing, not a word, not even her name. Margaret nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, as if acknowledging a fact rather than responding to an insult. She didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't ask to come inside. Instead, she turned slightly, setting the grocery bag down on the porch with care, like it still mattered, like normal things still had their place in this moment. And then she straightened her coat, her movements slow and deliberate, her face unreadable. "I see," she said quietly, more to herself than to them. And without another word, she stepped off the porch, walking down the same path she had swept clean every morning for years, her back straight, her pace steady, leaving behind not just a house, but the illusion that it had ever truly belonged to them. And as she reached the end of the driveway, she paused just briefly, not to look back but to take a breath, the kind of breath that comes before something shifts, something irreversible. Because Margaret Whitmore was not a woman who made scenes. And she was not a woman who lost things without understanding exactly how they were taken. And as the evening light faded across the quiet street, one truth settled into place with absolute clarity. They thought they had locked her out, but they had no idea what she still held the key to. 48 hours earlier the house had still carried the quiet rhythm Margaret Whitmore had built over decades. The kind of rhythm that did not demand attention but held everything together in small, steady ways. The hum of the refrigerator in the early morning, the soft scrape of her slippers across the kitchen floor, the familiar click of the coffee maker at exactly 6:15 as it had been every day since her husband passed. She moved through each space with a kind of practiced grace, not out of habit alone but out of respect for a life she had maintained piece by piece. The curtains were always open just enough to let in the first light, the table always wiped clean before breakfast, the mail stacked neatly by the entryway. Everything had its place because she had given it one. And yet something had begun to shift, not loudly, not in a way that could be pointed to or named, but in the pauses between words, in the way Ashley would stand a little longer in the doorway watching her without speaking, in the way Daniel no longer lingered in the kitchen for morning coffee, choosing instead to check his phone in silence. The conversations had grown shorter, more functional, as if the house had become a place of transaction rather than belonging. Margaret noticed these things the way she noticed everything, quietly, without accusation. She did not ask questions right away because she had learned long ago that answers given too easily were rarely honest. Instead she observed the way Ashley began referring to the house differently, not as something shared but as something managed, the way she spoke about space, about change, about how certain rooms could be used more efficiently. Words that sounded reasonable on the surface but carried something colder underneath. One afternoon Margaret had paused at the hallway table where she kept a small wooden tray for keys and letters. The arrangement had been disturbed, not dramatically, just slightly enough for someone else to miss it. But not her. The envelope she had left unopened had been moved, rotated just a few inches, as if someone had picked it up and put it back without understanding that its position mattered. She said nothing, simply adjusted it back into place. Later that evening she heard Ashley speaking softly on the phone in the living room. Her voice lowered in a way that was not meant to be overheard, phrases drifting through the air like fragments that did not quite connect. Paperwork, timing, signatures. Margaret remained in the kitchen, her hands steady as she dried a dish, her expression unchanged, but her attention sharpened. Daniel entered shortly after, his footsteps slower than usual. He glanced toward the living room, then at Margaret, and for a moment it seemed as though he might say something, anything, but instead he reached for a glass of water and avoided her eyes. That was when she understood that whatever was happening had already moved beyond conversation. The following morning Ashley stood in the doorway of the dining room, her posture composed, her tone casual, almost rehearsed. She spoke about needing a fresh start, about how sometimes change was necessary for growth. Margaret listened without interrupting, her face calm, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She did not challenge the words because she recognized them for what they were, not an invitation to discuss but a statement of direction. And when Ashley finished, there was a silence that lingered just long enough to reveal what had not been said. Daniel remained seated at the table, his shoulders slightly tense, his gaze fixed downward. Margaret looked at him then, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a quiet clarity that settled deeper than either. She rose from her chair, smoothed the front of her sweater, and walked past them both, without a word, moving toward the hallway where the house still felt like hers, where every detail still carried her imprint. And as she passed the entryway mirror she caught her reflection, not diminished, not uncertain but composed, as if something within her had shifted into place. Not yet action, not yet decision but awareness, the kind that comes before everything changes. And in that moment Margaret Whitmore understood that whatever they believed they were preparing, they had already underestimated the one person who had never needed to speak loudly to be heard. The shift did not arrive with a single moment but with a series of small displacements that only Margaret Whitmore seemed to notice, the kind of changes that would appear insignificant to anyone who had not spent years anchoring themselves to every inch of that house. The first was the study door. It had always been left slightly open, just enough for the light from the hallway to spill across the wooden floor. But one afternoon she found it closed, not gently, not by accident but firmly, as if something inside required privacy it had never needed before. She paused there for a second longer than usual, her hand hovering near the handle, not touching it, just acknowledging that something had been claimed without being spoken aloud. Later that same evening she walked past the hallway closet and noticed that the spare set of keys she kept in a small ceramic bowl were no longer there. She did not react immediately. She did not call out or ask a question. Instead she continued walking. Her steps measured, her breathing even, storing the detail away like a piece of a puzzle that was slowly assembling itself without permission. Daniel's behavior shifted in quieter ways. He began to speak less during dinner, his responses shorter, more contained, as if he were rehearsing silence rather than conversation. When Margaret asked him about his work he nodded, offered a few words, then returned to his plate, and when their eyes almost met he would look away just before the connection could form. Not out of anger but avoidance, the kind that suggests knowledge rather than confusion. Ashley on the other hand moved through the house with a different kind of confidence, subtle but undeniable. She lingered in spaces that had once belonged to Margaret's routines, rearranging small objects under the guise of organization, shifting a picture frame slightly to the left, replacing a set of coasters with a newer one, updating the calendar on the wall without asking. None of it overt, none of it confrontational. But each action carried a quiet message. This space is no longer yours to define. One morning Margaret entered the kitchen and found Ashley standing at the counter with a folder open in front of her, the papers neatly aligned, her finger tracing down a page as if reviewing something important. She looked up when Margaret entered, smiled in that controlled way she had perfected, and closed the folder just a second too quickly. "Just organizing some things," she said, her tone light. But the words landed with a weight that did not match their simplicity. Margaret nodded once, not because she believed her, but because she did not need to challenge something that had already revealed itself. That afternoon Margaret went to retrieve a document from the drawer where she kept personal papers, a place she had maintained with precision for years, but when she opened it she found the contents slightly disturbed, not missing, not yet, but handled, shifted, as if someone had been searching for something specific. She closed the drawer slowly, her hand resting on the edge for a moment longer than necessary, her mind moving through possibilities with a clarity that came from experience rather than suspicion. She did not panic, she did not confront, because she understood something fundamental that they did not, that control was not established through loud declarations but through quiet certainty. That evening as the sun dipped below the horizon casting long shadows across the living room, Ashley's voice carried again from the other side of the house, lower this time, more urgent, phrases slipping through the walls in fragments. Timeline, transfer, finalize. Margaret stood by the window looking out at the familiar street, the same neighbors, the same trees, everything unchanged outside while something inside was being carefully rearranged without her consent. She exhaled slowly, not in defeat but in recognition, and when she turned back toward the room her expression remained composed, her posture steady, because in that moment Margaret Whitmore was no longer trying to understand what was happening. She already knew, and more importantly she knew that whatever they believed they were preparing, they had not yet accounted for the one variable they could not control, her. Margaret Whitmore did not need confirmation, but it came anyway, quiet and unmistakable, like the final piece of a puzzle sliding into place. It happened late that evening when the house had settled into its usual stillness, the kind of silence that once felt peaceful but now carried something heavier beneath it. She had been in her bedroom, sitting at the edge of the bed, reviewing a small stack of documents she kept in a leather folder, papers she had organized herself over the years with a precision that no one else in the house fully understood, when she heard the faint murmur of voices from downstairs, not the casual conversation of a family sharing space, but something more deliberate, measured. She rose without urgency, her movements calm, her footsteps soft against the carpet as she made her way toward the hallway. She did not rush, did not allow curiosity to turn into haste, because she already sensed what she would find. As she reached the top of the staircase she paused. Not hiding, not eavesdropping in the way someone might if they feared being discovered, but simply standing still, allowing the voices below to reach her clearly. Ashley was speaking, her tone lower than usual but steady, confident, the kind of voice used when discussing something that had already been decided. "It will be easier once everything is finalized," she said, and there was a brief pause before Daniel responded. His voice quieter, uncertain in a way Margaret had not heard in years. "Are you sure this is the right way to do it?" he asked, and for a moment there was silence, the kind that stretches just long enough to reveal tension. Then Ashley answered, her words precise, controlled. "It is the only way if we want full control. The paperwork is already in motion, we just need to follow through." Margaret stood there, her hand resting lightly on the banister, her expression unchanged, but inside something settled, not shattered, not broken but clarified. The vague sense of unease she had carried over the past 2 days now had shape, direction, intention. This was not about misunderstandings or adjustments or even disagreements. This was about removal, about taking something that had never been offered. She listened a moment longer as Ashley continued, mentioning timelines, legal steps, and arrangements that suggested a level of planning far beyond what Daniel seemed comfortable with. He spoke again, hesitating, "What about Mom?" And the question hung in the air, fragile, almost out of place. Ashley did not raise her voice, did not argue, she simply answered with a calm that felt colder than anger. "She will adjust, people always do." Margaret closed her eyes for just a second, not in pain, not in disbelief, but in acknowledgement, because in that sentence there was no uncertainty, no hesitation, only assumption. She opened her eyes again and turned away from the staircase, returning to her room with the same steady pace she had used to approach it, each step deliberate, grounded. When she reached the bed she sat down once more, placing the folder carefully beside her, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She did not cry, did not react outwardly, because what she felt was not shock anymore. It was understanding, the kind that removes all illusion and leaves only truth, and the truth was simple. They believed they were in control. They believed that preparation equaled ownership, that silence meant weakness. Margaret reached for the folder and opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the familiar documents, deeds, signatures, records that told a story very different from the one being constructed downstairs, a story rooted in years, in decisions made long before Ashley had ever stepped through the front door. She closed the folder again with a quiet certainty, her posture straightening slightly as if aligning with something deeper than the moment, because now she knew not only what they were doing, but what they did not understand, and that difference would matter, more than they could possibly imagine. Margaret Whitmore did not sleep much that night. Not because her mind was restless but because it had become too clear, the kind of clarity that does not allow for distraction. She lay in bed with the lights off, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling, listening to the quiet movements of the house as if it were revealing its final secrets one by one, and somewhere between the ticking of the hallway clock and the distant hum of the heating system, her thoughts moved not forward but backward, tracing the years that had led to this moment. She saw again the day she and her husband first stood in the empty living room, the walls bare, the air carrying that distinct scent of fresh paint and possibility. He had stood beside her with his hands in his pockets, smiling in that quiet way he had, and said that this house was not just a purchase, it was a promise, a place where no matter what happened outside those walls, she would always belong. Margaret had believed him then, not because the words were comforting, but because he had never spoken lightly. They had built everything there together, every corner shaped by intention, every detail chosen with care, the kitchen cabinets they installed themselves over a long weekend, the garden he planted out back with rows that never quite stayed straight, the small imperfections that made the house feel lived in rather than designed. And when he passed, it was not just the loss of a person but the silence that followed, a silence Margaret had learned to carry without complaint, maintaining the home not as a burden but as a continuation of something that still mattered. She remembered the day Daniel moved back in after his own life began to shift, how she had welcomed him without question, offering space, stability, something familiar, and later when Ashley came into the picture, Margaret had done the same, setting an extra place at the table, making room in ways that went beyond the physical. She had never asked for gratitude, never needed acknowledgement, because for her family was not a transaction, it was a responsibility, something you upheld quietly, consistently, without conditions. But now, lying there in the darkness, she saw those years differently, not as mistakes, not as wasted effort, but as foundations that had been built under her name, under her decisions, in ways that could not be undone by a conversation in the living room or a plan whispered in the hallway. She turned her head slightly, her gaze falling toward the nightstand where a small framed photograph rested, her husband's face captured in a moment of calm confidence, and for a second the room felt less empty, not because he was there, but because what he had left behind had not disappeared, it had simply been underestimated. Margaret sat up slowly, reaching for the leather folder she had placed beside the bed earlier, her fingers moving across its surface with familiarity. She opened it again, not to reread what she already knew but to confirm something deeper. The documents were all there, organized, precise, each page carrying weight not just legally but personally, the deed, the signatures, the records that told a story no one else in the house had fully bothered to understand. She closed the folder once more and placed it carefully back on the nightstand, her posture straight, her expression calm, because now there was no uncertainty left, only direction. Whatever Ashley believed she was taking, whatever Daniel believed he was allowing, neither of them had grasped the full picture, and Margaret Whitmore, who had spent a lifetime holding things together without recognition, now understood that the same quiet strength they had overlooked would be the very thing they could not undo. And as the first light of morning began to edge its way through the curtains, she rose from the bed, not hurried, not shaken, but ready in a way that did not require announcement, because some changes are not declared, they are simply made. Margaret Whitmore stepped out of the house that morning with the same quiet composure she had carried for years, her coat buttoned neatly, her handbag resting against her side, nothing in her appearance suggesting that anything had changed, and yet everything had. She paused briefly at the front door, her hand resting on the handle for just a second longer than usual, not out of hesitation but acknowledgement, as if marking the moment without needing to name it. Inside the house Ashley was already moving through the kitchen, her voice light as she spoke to Daniel about errands and schedules, the kind of casual conversation that assumes control without needing to declare it. Margaret listened for a moment, then stepped outside, closing the door behind her with care, the soft click of it settling into the morning air. She walked down the driveway at a steady pace, her posture straight, her steps unhurried, the neighborhood unchanged, the same quiet street, the same trimmed lawns, the same sense of normalcy that made what was unfolding inside her own home feel almost invisible to the world beyond it. She reached her car, placed her handbag on the passenger seat, and sat behind the wheel, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. She did not start the engine right away. Instead, she allowed herself a moment of stillness. Not to reflect, not to question, but to align, because what came next would require precision, not emotion. When she finally turned the key, the engine started smoothly, the familiar sound grounding her in something steady, something reliable. She drove first to the bank, a place she had visited countless times over the years, always with purpose, always with clarity, and today was no different. Inside the building the air was cool, the lighting bright, everything orderly in a way she appreciated. She approached the counter and greeted the clerk by name, her voice calm, her demeanor composed, nothing in her tone suggesting urgency. And yet the request she made was deliberate. She asked to review her accounts, to confirm access, to update certain authorizations. The clerk nodded, processing each request with professional efficiency, unaware of the weight behind them. Margaret signed the necessary forms with steady hands, each signature precise, each movement intentional. When she left the bank, she did not rush. She simply returned to her car and sat for a moment before starting the engine again. Her next stop was not spontaneous. It had already been decided. She drove to a small office building across town, one she had not visited in some time but had never forgotten, the name on the door still the same, the familiarity of it offering a quiet reassurance. Inside she was greeted by a receptionist who recognized her after a brief moment, the kind of recognition that comes not from frequent visits but from lasting impressions. She was asked to wait, and she did, sitting upright, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression calm. When she was finally invited into the office, the man behind the desk stood to greet her. His demeanor respectful, his tone warm. He had known her husband, had worked with them years ago. And as Margaret took her seat, she placed the leather folder on the desk in front of her, opening it with the same quiet certainty she had carried all morning. She did not speak immediately. She allowed the documents to speak first. The pages laid out clearly, the information structured in a way that required no explanation. The man reviewed them carefully, his expression shifting slightly as he understood the situation without needing it to be spelled out. When he finally looked up at her, she met his gaze steadily. And in that moment there was no trace of doubt, no hesitation, only clarity. Margaret Whitmore had not come to ask what could be done. She had come to begin. And as she spoke, her voice remained calm, measured, grounded in something far stronger than the situation unfolding behind her. Because while others had been planning quietly within the walls of her home, she had already stepped beyond them, and what she was putting into motion would not require permission, only time. By the time Margaret Whitmore stepped out of the office building, the afternoon sun had shifted just enough to cast longer shadows across the pavement, and there was a quiet finality in the way she paused at the top of the steps, not to admire the day, but to acknowledge that something had already begun to move forward without the possibility of being undone. She walked toward her car with the same steady pace, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if nothing out of the ordinary had taken place. Yet inside the leather folder now resting in her handbag were documents that had been reviewed, verified, and quietly set into motion, instructions that did not require confrontation, only execution. She drove home without turning on the radio, the silence inside the car not empty but focused, each passing block bringing her closer to a house that no longer held the same meaning it had just days before, and yet still carried something deeper that could not be erased by a lock or a conversation. When she pulled into the driveway, she noticed immediately that something else had shifted, a small detail that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. The front porch light had been changed, not broken, not replaced with care, but swapped for a brighter, colder bulb that cast a harsher glow across the entryway. It illuminated the door in a way that felt less welcoming, more clinical. As if the house itself had been redefined overnight, Margaret stepped out of the car and closed the door gently behind her, her gaze moving briefly across the front yard. Everything in place, everything ordinary, and yet nothing quite the same. She walked up the driveway and approached the front door, her hand reaching for the handle not with expectation, but with confirmation. She already knew what would happen, and when the key failed to turn, when the resistance met her exactly as it had before, there was no surprise, no hesitation, only a quiet acceptance of what had already been decided inside those walls. The door opened shortly after, Ashley standing there again, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, but this time there was something different in her eyes, not uncertainty but anticipation, as if she expected a reaction, a protest, something that would validate the position she had taken. Daniel stood behind her once more, his presence familiar and distant at the Same time, his silence heavier now. Margaret looked at them both, her gaze steady, her face unreadable. And for a brief moment the air between them felt suspended, waiting. Ashley spoke first, her tone even controlled. "We talked about this," she said, though no such conversation had truly taken place. "It is better if you start making arrangements." Margaret did not respond immediately. She allowed the words to settle, not because they held weight, but because they revealed something important. They believed this was finished, that the decision had already been made, that her role in it was simply to accept. She nodded once, a small gesture that seemed to satisfy Ashley's expectation of compliance, and without another word she stepped back from the door, turning away with the same quiet composure she had maintained all day. She walked down the driveway again, her steps measured, her posture straight, but this time there was no pause at the end, no moment of reflection. She reached her car, opened the door and sat inside, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, and for a second she allowed herself to close her eyes, not in defeat, not in sorrow, but in focus, because what they had just done was not the end of anything. It was simply the point at which their plan had fully revealed itself, and as she opened her eyes again, her expression remained calm, her breathing steady, because Margaret Whitmore had already moved beyond the door they had closed, and everything that followed would unfold on terms they had never considered. The next morning arrived without announcement, the kind of quiet, ordinary beginning that gave no indication of how much had already shifted beneath the surface. Sunlight filtered across the street in soft lines, catching on the edges of windows and parked cars, everything appearing exactly as it had the day before, and yet inside the house on that corner, the balance had already begun to change in ways neither Ashley nor Daniel could yet see. Margaret Whitmore did not rush, she never had. She moved through her morning with the same steady rhythm, though not within the walls they believed they controlled, but from a place of quiet certainty that required no witness. Her actions had already been set in motion, and now it was simply a matter of timing. When she arrived back on the street she did not park directly in the driveway. Instead she pulled over along the curb, the engine idling softly as she looked toward the house, her gaze calm, observant. The front door closed, the curtains slightly drawn, everything appearing undisturbed. She turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, her shoes meeting the pavement with a soft, deliberate sound. As she approached the house she noticed something new, a small envelope placed near the base of the front door. Not there the day before, not something she had left. She stopped just a few steps away, her eyes settling on it without bending down immediately, because she understood instinctively what it represented. Not a message from Ashley, not a note of explanation, but something else entirely, something formal, something structured. She moved closer and picked it up, the paper crisp, the seal unbroken, her name printed clearly across the front in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. She held it for a moment, not opening it right away, not because she feared what it contained, but because she already knew. The door behind it opened suddenly, Ashley stepping out with the same composed expression she had worn the day before, though this time there was a flicker of something else beneath it, a confidence that had grown stronger overnight. Daniel appeared just behind her, his posture slightly tense, his gaze shifting between Margaret and the envelope in her hand. Ashley spoke first, her tone measured, almost rehearsed. "You should read that," she said, as if presenting something official, something final. Margaret looked at her briefly, then back at the envelope, and with calm precision she opened it, unfolding the document inside without haste, her eyes scanning the text, the language formal, structured, designed to assert authority, to create the impression of finality. But as she read, her expression did not change, not even slightly, because the words, while deliberate, did not carry the weight Ashley believed they did. She folded the paper once more and held it loosely in her hand, then lifted her gaze to meet Ashley's, steady, composed, and for the first time there was no need for silence to carry meaning. "You filed this yesterday," she said quietly, her voice even, not a question, not an accusation, simply a statement. Ashley straightened slightly, as if preparing for resistance. "It is already in process," she replied, her tone firm. "It is better this way for everyone." Margaret nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the effort, and then she stepped slightly to the side, her gaze shifting past them toward the doorway, the same doorway they had tried to turn into a boundary. "You should check your mail," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle, the words simple, but carrying something neither Ashley nor Daniel immediately understood. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, as Ashley's expression faltered just enough to reveal uncertainty. Daniel glanced toward the interior of the house as if sensing something had already changed, And in that moment the balance shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably, because while they had spent their time creating the illusion of control, Margaret Whitmore had already set something real into motion, something that did not rely on locked doors or spoken claims, something that existed beyond the reach of their assumptions. And as she stood there, holding the paper they believed defined the situation, her calm presence carried a quiet certainty that would soon make it clear. The outcome they expected was no longer theirs to decide. The silence that followed did not last long, because inside the house something had already begun to unravel in ways neither Ashley nor Daniel had anticipated. Daniel was the first to move, stepping back into the hallway with a hesitant urgency, his footsteps no longer measured but uncertain, as if something unseen had shifted beneath him. Ashley lingered at the doorway for a moment longer, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to maintain the composure she had carefully constructed. But there was a crack now, subtle but unmistakable, the kind that appears when certainty meets something it cannot immediately explain. Margaret Whitmore did not follow them inside. She remained where she was, standing just beyond the threshold, her posture straight, her hands relaxed at her sides, her presence calm and unyielding. She did not need to enter to know what was happening. She had already set it in motion inside. The sound of paper being handled echoed faintly through the open doorway, followed by a pause, then another, longer this time, as if the words on the page required more than a single reading to fully register. Daniel's voice came next, lower than before, edged with confusion that had not been there the day before. Ashley, this says? He stopped, the sentence unfinished because the meaning had already begun to settle in. Ashley took the document from him, her movements sharper now, less controlled, her eyes scanning quickly, then again slower, as if repetition might change what was written. But the words did not shift, they did not soften, they remained exactly as they had been filed, precise, formal and irreversible. Margaret could see it from where she stood. Not the document itself, but the change in Ashley's posture, the tightening of her shoulders, the way her confidence no longer filled the space around her. And when Ashley looked up again, her expression had altered, not completely, not enough to admit defeat, but enough to reveal that something had slipped beyond her control. What is this? She asked, her voice no longer carrying the same certainty. Margaret did not answer immediately. She allowed the question to exist for a moment, not out of hesitation, but because it no longer required urgency. Then she spoke, her tone calm, even grounded in something far more stable than the tension unfolding in front of her. It is a correction, she said simply, the words quiet but carrying weight. Daniel stepped forward then, the document still in his hand, his eyes searching her face as if trying to reconcile the person he knew with the situation he had failed to understand. Mom? We did not know, he began, but Margaret raised her hand slightly, not to silence him, but to pause the moment because explanations now were not necessary. What had been done had already been done. You did not ask, she replied, her voice steady, not accusatory, not emotional, just clear. Ashley's grip on the paper tightened slightly, her gaze shifting between Margaret and the document, as if searching for something that would restore the structure she had built. But there was nothing left to reinterpret. The ownership, the authority, the decisions that had been assumed were now defined in a way that could not be negotiated. Margaret took a small step forward, not into the house, but closer to the threshold, her presence filling the space without force. You changed the locks, she said, her voice calm, almost reflective. But you never understood what those locks actually protected. The words settled between them, not as a threat, but as a conclusion. Daniel lowered his gaze, the weight of the situation pressing in quietly. Ashley remained still, her posture rigid, her expression controlled but no longer certain, and Margaret, without raising her voice, without stepping further inside, had already reclaimed everything that mattered. She turned then, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same composed movement that had defined every step she had taken since the moment the key no longer worked. She walked back toward her car, the morning light steady around her, the street unchanged, but the balance of power entirely different. And as she reached the driver's door she paused briefly, not to look back, but to acknowledge what had just been settled, because some endings do not need to be witnessed to be complete, they simply are. And Margaret Whitmore, who had once been quietly pushed out of her own home, now understood that she had never truly left it at all.